morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's breakfast session, International Energy Security Amid Growing Tensions. My name is Reid Blakemore, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. The framing nor the timing of this session could not be more auspicious. Growing tensions in this case clearly refers to the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on energy markets in Europe and beyond, and what that means for global energy security. Yet, while market volatility and supply constraints driven by a war in Ukraine demand a response from the international community in the short term, a much longer-term shift is now clearly afoot as energy security returns to the fore as a policy priority on par with energy transition and climate action. Nonetheless, the realities of climate change and the urgency of reaching net zero emissions by 2050 remains the biggest challenge of our time. And with coal imports to Europe on the rise in order to meet energy security needs, and the obvious risk at hand that the pursuit of energy security delays or sets back or undermines climate action is increasingly real as well. Europe indeed might be feeling the sharpest effects of today's geopolitical crisis on energy markets, but the lessons of this period will have lasting consequences on energy policy priorities around the world as countries build and navigate pathways to net zero. Europe and the West might be responding to the crisis of now, but with COP27 on the horizon, the rest of the world is watching and determining what that means for their response to the crisis of tomorrow, climate change. The question, therefore, for our session this morning is, how do we build an effective response to the current energy market turmoil in Europe and beyond without being forced into what we're referring to at the Atlantic Council as a false choice between climate action and energy security? It's a question, frankly, that makes me glad I'm just the moderator on this session, and why I'm glad that we have such a distinguished panel to which I can leave the debate to. To that end, I'd like to welcome Jacob Irving, President and CEO of the Energy Council of Canada, Julie Dabrusin, Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Natural Resources and to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and then joining us virtually, Adel Gammal, Secretary General of the European Energy Research Alliance, and John Cooper, Director General of FuelsEurope. To get things started, I'd like to give our panelists the opportunity to cover a few big, broad areas of this issue, beginning with Europe, of course, the issue at hand, and then moving on to where Canada and the West can play a positive role both in the short and long-term solutions required for the moment. So, Adel, I'd like to kick things off with you. There's a good sense of how we got here, but I think the core of the question you might be best positioned to answer for us this morning is, where is Europe headed, and what are the opportunities and challenges on the horizon?
Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à mes amis francophones. It's really a pleasure to be on this conference. I really dislike starting with some figures, but I think it's important just to set up the context to explain a little bit the situation of Europe, which is very, very different from Canada or from the United States. The energy dependency of Europe globally is 60%, and when it comes to oil, we reach 95%, and for gas, 90%. So we're totally dependent on fossil fuel imports for gas and oil, basically. The situation with the invasion of Ukraine is that we are in a kind of, I would say, strange but dramatic game between Russia and the European Union, in the sense that for Europe it's absolutely critical to get, on the short term at least, to secure basically the imports of these fossil fuels from Russia. And to give you an idea, 40% of our gas demand is constituted by gas coming from Russia, mainly by pipeline. And for oil, we're talking about 30% approximately. Oil is not such a problem because it's a global market. It's easy to change our supply chain. Gas is much more complicated. Just to give you an idea, 40% of the gas demand, it represents 155 billion cubic meters. And that's approximately in the order of magnitude of 40% of the global LNG market. So it's explained very quickly, you cannot just replace this import by pipeline through LNG. The impact for Europe, of course, is dramatic. And I can tell you, for those living in Europe, we're really navigating by the day. It's the first time since the oil crisis of 73 that we're talking about rationing supply, that we're talking about blackouts, that we're talking about stopping supplies to some industries, that we're considering the possibility of even households heating themselves. So it's really dramatic. The risk, of course, is huge because the prices are going up. The economic growth is going down. We run a severe risk of stagflation. And more than that, the social stability is really at stake because we don't know how the people will be coping with high prices and shortage of supplies. So if you look at the other side of the equation on Russia, it's also a bit critical in the sense that the whole Russian economy is primarily an extractive economy, basically. And probably more than one third of its economy is about fossil fuel. 70% of gas is exported to EU, and about 50% of its oil exported to EU. So EU is an absolutely critical partner for Russia to continue to finance its economy, and in particular the war now. The critical thing, of course, is that it has been carefully engineered. Russia has managed to get the prices up very significantly. Just to give an idea, and I speak under the control, of course, of my colleague here, gas prices have increased by a factor of 10 if we compare to last year. So the point is, even if we run away from Russian imports, the problem is that the revenues of Russia remain extremely high. And so in order to really severe Russian revenues, you need really to completely cut off this dependency. How do we do that? In Europe, we have a program which is called, well, the European Commission has published a strategy which is called Repower EU. And basically, this strategy is twofold. It's basically accelerating very significantly the transition to low-carbon technology, so moving away from fossil fuels. But we all know that supply chain and other supply chain have imposed major constraints. And so there's a need to replace also the gas will not be supplied anymore by Russia. And this is about finding alternative supplies. And this is very complicated because by pipeline, the capabilities are very limited. They are all almost saturated. And by LNG, as I said, it's 40% of the global market, which is already very tight at the moment. So this is a bit the background against which we need to consider the situation today. And I would compare it to a dramatic high-stake poker game where EU vows to get rid or to emancipate completely from its dependency to Russian fossil fuels, but still need it badly in the short term, while Russia has the possibility to cut it at any moment in time, which is, by the way, happening as we speak, progressively, but also needs to secure revenues to fuel its economy and the war it carries on Ukraine.
Thanks, Adel. And I think, your reference to it being a high-stakes poker game is quite apt, being that we seem to be seeing a significant move by Russia currently as to whether or not we wonder, after Nord Stream 1 comes out of maintenance next week, whether or not those gas volumes, continue to make their way into Europe. Turning to John, because I want to look to a little bit of an industry perspective within Europe. How are your members navigating, the signals for diversification, which we're seeing from European policymakers, at the same time that the market realities of the crisis poses a challenge for keeping costs down for consumers, and still at the same time, your members pursue their commitments to reduce emissions and reach net zero by 2050? A lot going on.
Thank you. Thanks, Reid. My initial reaction is, how long have we got? I mean, that is a set of questions that encompasses almost everything. First, thanks for the invitation. Second, thanks to Adel for a fantastic introduction to an overview of where we are. So FuelsEurope is the organization that speaks for the fuels industry, the major fuel, or actually all the fuels refiners in Europe. And those companies are also, in many cases, significant investors in several types of renewables now. Being in Brussels, we felt already we were kind of in the eye of the storm. Clearly, Brussels institutions, the European Union has got a very strong ambition for climate neutrality by 2050, which we have clearly supported and also put in place already a strategy to evolve. We know, and our members know very well, that the pathway for the demand of petroleum in Europe goes towards zero around 2050. And everybody's got on board with that, with an understanding of how you transition to that. And of course, what's happened since February has just turned that on its head. And we've now got member states, in many cases, asking for more oil, asking for help to bring in more diesel into Europe. And with some industries, including the power sector, actually moving from using gas to use oil or oil components for some of their uses. And it's been a strange place to try and navigate that. I think, simply put, the long-term objective is very clear to everybody. The challenge is how do you rationalize actions that we are now being asked to take that may be short-term in need, but nobody knows what we mean by short-term. I'll give you an example. That in refineries over the last few years transitioned to use significant natural gas to power the refinery for the power station, the hydrogen units, various process needs for energy and heat. And that trend is actually reversing right now because we're being asked to please use less gas. And that means the potential is to go back and use oil products there. That means some capital investments. It also potentially means that we request to relax certain requirements, for example, on carbon pricing systems or air quality, because progress that we made in that direction was based on the use of some natural gas. So if we're going to go backwards, and we're being asked by governments to go backwards, we have to ask, how long is this for? And over what basis can we make these investments? It's quite hard to know because actually the companies still would prefer to do a very clear pathway towards low carbon renewables types investments. And so it's quite confusing. I think the other thing I'd say longer term is one of the things we're keen to see is we're pleased to see the Repower EU initiative. It brings into focus a lot of the challenges. We still feel as if there's more to do actually stitching all the pieces together for your liquids strategy. One of the interesting things out of where we are today is that it's revealed the flexibility and durability of liquid fuels. And it's worth noting that while Europe has got itself in a real bind around the supply of gas, actually there are still some 60 countries in the world that can supply crude oil. And we've got actually quite a good track record as an industry of navigating difficulties, whether they're sanctions or supply difficulties, because of the flexibility having 60 countries with very low cost logistics to bring oil into Europe. And of course, the importance of liquids now for all types of emergency logistics and the military, which NATO clearly very reliant on liquid fuels to power itself. We believe as an industry that there's still a role for liquids when they can be renewable, made from something other than petroleum. And there is some traction for that agenda in Europe, particularly for aviation and maritime, but much less so for other sectors. We would, as a sector, quite like to see a more joined-up strategy for the transition of the liquid sector, to have some use in land-based transport, focusing longer term, certainly on aviation and maritime. But we believe there's more to do to make that a major case for investment. Let me stop there. I've said enough as an introduction, I guess. Thanks.
Thanks, John. And I think you pulled on a number of different threads we'll follow up on later, including something Adel mentioned, which is the Repower EU plan. So I want to put a cap in that, and we'll come back to it. But the other item both of you have mentioned is the diversification of supply, which is why I think we're fortunate that we have two colleagues representing Canada here, which is one of those obvious alternatives in this case. So, Madam Parliamentary Secretary, I'd like to go to you first. We're honored to have you today representing the Canadian government. In light of this crisis in Europe and the trends that both Adel and John have mentioned, what role does Canada have to play in terms of helping Europeans navigate this crisis?
Well, thank you et merci à tout le monde. Je suis très contente d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Et juste à dire, je suis secrétaire parlementaire pour les ressources naturelles, mais aussi pour environnement et changement climatique. Et je pense que ça, c'est très important quand on regarde la direction pour notre gouvernement, comment on voit le futur. C'est vraiment que la sécurité énergétique passe par le développement d'énergie propre. So just to say that's a focus, and I really like the fact that you framed it as, is it a false choice? Mm-hmm. Because it is, and I think John set it out very clearly about, we know where we need to go. We need to go, and we know that there are certain urgent short-term needs. It's a really interesting question about how you define short-term. But in the long term, Canada is also there to support at both sides. So we've been there to support our allies in the short term, but we're also working, as part of an EU working group on energy security. What's a long-term piece, and what's our role there? And before we came up here, we had a really interesting conversation, I think, about some of the other pieces where we play a role. Au Canada, on est chanceux parce que nous avons l'hydroélectricité, nous avons beaucoup d'options pour le solaire. Nous avons beaucoup ici au Canada, quand on regarde les énergies propres. Quelque chose dont on ne parle pas peut-être assez, c'est aussi les minéraux critiques. Et je pense que ça, c'est quelque chose dont on devrait parler un peu plus parce que ça, c'est une partie importante pour tout qu'on parle quand on regarde le futur. So here in Canada this week, we're doing Zero Emission Vehicle Week. We're celebrating all that we're doing to transition to zero emission vehicles. There's a really big economic opportunity for Canada in that. And we're seeing, battery plants being built here in Canada. And how do we start pushing for all of those really great jobs here in Canada, which is obviously a focus for our government as well when we're looking for it. But what goes into that production? And so things like the development of a critical minerals strategy and how we work with our allies to be that reliable producer and to be there for those pieces is also a really important piece to look towards as we go forward. So I think that's one place where we certainly have to be focusing more. And a big concern that I might have is to see the Russian invasion of Ukraine as being used as an excuse when we're looking at maintenant parce que je vais entre les deux langues, je perds mes mots. les chaînes d'approvisionnement, the supply chains. Thank you. When we look at those issues that are facing our country, there could be a big push. I think John pointed to it too about, okay, well, let's build that infrastructure. Mm-hmm. For the short term, but none of that infrastructure is going to be available in the short term. Mm-hmm. And it has long-term consequences. So that's one of the big challenges that we'd be facing into.
Definitely. Especially, again, time horizons matter so much in this conversation, whether you're talking about how we define the short term or how our response to those short-term needs position us for long-term infrastructure investments. And so, Jacob, I'd like to turn to you next. Given your position at the helm of the Energy Council of Canada, give us the industry perspective here from Canada. What are the things that Canadian companies can be doing now to help with this crisis while also positioning Europe to be successful over the long term?
Thanks, Reid. Again, everyone, my name is Jacob Irving. I'm the President of the Energy Council of Canada. Je peux prendre des questions en français, si vous voulez bien. But again, thank you to my colleagues on the panel for setting the stage for the conversation. And your question as well, Reid, what can our Canadian companies do? I think in many ways, remaining champions of the rules-based international order for trade is extremely important. And us Canadians, I think, understand that better than many. I'm just going to go back in time a little bit, my sort of own life history, if you don't mind. For most of my, I remember the Canada-U.S. free trade debate when I was a kid. I was in high school back then, and I remember it. It was visceral. It was, is Canada going to get closer to the United States in trade, and what does that mean? And people thought that Canada was going to be swallowed up by the United States. There were advertisements where we were erasing the border between Canada and U.S. and redrawing the line. And it was emotional. And ultimately, Canada decided to enter into a free trade agreement with the United States, which then later became NAFTA, which is now CUSMA and the like. But, you know, I remember at the time it was, is Canada going to lose its identity by becoming more of a free trader? And you look at it now, and I mean, it's almost hilarious in hindsight. I mean, culturally, and Canada owns the top 40 of popular music in the United States and North America, right? Just turn on the radio, right? We were not swallowed up by the United States. In fact, we came into our own by engaging in a rules-based system for trade. Now, why do I say all of that in this context? This is actually a question of trust now. And, you know, Canada to the United States, we send them almost as much oil as Russia sends to Europe. Russia sends about twice as much natural gas as we send to the United States, but we send a lot of natural gas to the United States. We also send electricity. Quebec knows this very well. We are a net energy exporter as a country in Canada. We have more than enough energy for ourselves. We have energy to spare. We are swimming in excess energy capacity in Canada, and we are looking at a world that is starving and that has real security concerns. And I guess the message from us Canadians to our potential customers in Europe in this is, you know, you can trust us. And why? I often say Canada is a responsible energy developer because we're a responsive energy developer. We develop our energy within the framework of an established constitutional democracy. And our companies do well by this, and they need to champion this as well. Because if I want to put it bluntly, the reason why you could and should trust us to be your energy provider, whatever form of energy that might take in the near, medium, or long term, is because we don't threaten our customers in Canada. You know, it seems like a basic point, but in our relationship with the United States and the way we trade energy with them, we do not threaten energy supply to them when things go wrong on other issues. Russia can't say that. Russia uses energy as a weapon. Canada, we use it as a means to build relationships, as a means to solve problems. So I think, you know, I often I feel like in our Canadian experience that, you know, our approach to energy has been a little bit simplistic and myopic over the last, for my lifetime. It was basically, we'll make as much energy as the Americans will take, and they'll take as much as we can make. No need to advertise. It's not like that anymore. Mm-hmm. The world needs us, and we need to find customers other than the United States for our energy products. They used to be a dependent customer of ours. Now they're a competitor with us. And that's good. That's good for us. It's good for North America. It's good for the world. But we have to build better links to Europe and other places to share the excess that we have to maintain global stability and a rules-based trading system.
I think your last point there about, you know, reaching out and building those links with Europe and those other like-minded partners who, frankly, you know, are also going to be thinking more and more and more about the role that energy security plays in their policy and net zero pathways. You know, I'd like to ask a follow-up question to you both before turning back to Repower EU is, how do you go about building those links? What is the outreach that is currently being done, and in particular looking to, you know, a forum like COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where a lot of this is going to be on the agenda? What are the key goals that Canada kind of needs to set its eyes on over the next several months to, say, a year, and then we'll move to the long term? I'll start with you, Madam Parliamentary Secretary.
You can call me Julie.
Okay, fine.
It's a lot shorter. So part of it is just the relationships we've been continuing on, and making sure that we're there for our allies in Europe, and that they know that we're there. We've been working with them, for example, on hydrogen strategies. We've been working with them, like I said, on energy security working groups. So being an active partner in those conversations and making sure that we keep showing up, being there and being responsive in those conversations, a lot of it ends up being diplomatic in that way. And then, you know, being partners with our industries as well, and making sure that when we're doing that diplomatic outreach and supporting with our allies, that we're also working with our industries so that we have those good conversations going forward. And like I said, I think in the previous conversation we were having beforehand, having grown-up conversations about what are we facing into here. We do have a climate crisis. It's having impacts in our country right now. And we need to also make sure that we're energy secure and providing energy security to our allies. So that's the conversation we have to have. And I think that being that voice in a room is a really important place for Canada to be.
Mm-hmm. Jacob, I think similar question to you, but again, I think Julia's effectively covered a lot of this is diplomacy, a lot of that is being in the room. How does industry effectively get in the game here?
Well, I know that, for example, Canadian Gas Association is a member with us, and they've met with over 16 different international missions here in Canada to talk about this short-term pressure that is happening. What can Canada do more on? But also maintain an eye to the future. You look at natural gas, and right now, the Parliamentary Secretary is right, could we get the infrastructure built in time to help Europe and do more? It's a live question. But also good to remember that a lot of that infrastructure can change into hydrogen infrastructure into the future as well. So we have to think in terms of what we're good at now and what we can be good at later. Mm-hmm. And if there's a demand in Europe for hydrogen, they could receive natural gas from us and turn it into hydrogen on their shores, or we could turn natural gas into hydrogen on our shores and send it to Europe. It really depends on the signals that we receive from customers, that we receive from potential buyers. But all is possible. I guess that's what I would say in Canada, is that really our issues are not about engineering in Canada. They are really about public acceptance and acceptability. And first and foremost, and I think it's important to say that our relationship with Indigenous people here within our own borders in Canada is probably our primary concern. We are not going to get to critical minerals. We're not going to get to natural gas. We're not going to get to hydrogen. We're not going to get to hydropower. We're not going to get to any of our capabilities if we don't first consider the rights and needs of Indigenous people. And the good news is that in Canada, the industry got the memo, and that we are actually seeing great strides and improvements that way. So I think we have a lot of ability to help. We need strong signals from customers, but we have the raw materials, we have the capability, we have the talent, we have the expertise, and I think we also have the right mindset and the right way of doing energy, which is very important.
Well, I think that's a good signal to go back to the customers in this case and turn back to Adel and John. Thinking through Repower EU, a couple of things that have come out through this conversation are the balance between short-term, long-term needs, what that means for our considerations around infrastructure investment. And this is all happening in real time. In some cases, this is a live ball we're looking at. Repower EU, was announced by the Commission just a few short weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I might ask you both first, and let's start with Adel, and then we'll go to John. What are the key, almost concrete next steps you're looking to come out of Repower EU, and how should we think about those concrete steps in the context of this debate of short-term, long-term, and broader infrastructure investment needed to meet our energy security and net zero goals?
Well, thanks for the question. I really like this question because we are, in my organization, we will be publishing over the next week, I think, a white paper which is called Manifesto on Repower EU, which is really a critical analysis on the plans from the Commission. Critical in the sense that we will look at the different aspects of the plan and see what is the level of realism of the different topics and how we could increase it in some respect. Many things to say on this plan. First of all, it's very clear that you could see the competing priorities between, trying as much as possible not to disrupt clearly the social economic activity of the bloc. This is where we are now. And that mandate for having very short-term fixes, which in some cases, unfortunately, are really bad in terms of our pathway to carbon neutrality. To give you an idea, we are, of course, reinvesting in a number of fossil fuel infrastructures, be it regasification or LNG stations, regasification stations, internal pipeline for the landlocked countries and those which are not well connected internally. But also many countries are restarting coal-fired power plants. So all this is just a tragedy because all this is going against the pathway to the transition to net zero, which, by the way, we are very far from, even in Europe, where I think we're leading quite significantly in terms of the actions and the policies which have been put in place. We are not heading to the 1.5 degrees, or at least to where we need to be in Europe to achieve 1.5 degree globally. So a lot of immediate measures which are contradictory to the net zero objective. I said investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure. Encouraging certainly Norway, which is our biggest and closest friend, to restart exploring new gas fields, reopening coal power plants. All this is not good at all because this means investments that would be locked in over time, that need to be amortized, and this will definitely be an obstacle for acceleration of the transition. Now, if we look at the good part, or I would say the positive part of the plan, I think it's really overly ambitious. And in some respect, I think it's very good to be extremely ambitious because only there you can achieve significant results. But if you look at the picture, really, there's a lot of questions that we might have in terms of the speed of deployment, be it for industrial capacities, supply chain capacities, skills capacities, readiness of the infrastructure, so the power grid, for instance. So that's really a major issue, and we feel that a lot of the plans will probably happen, but on a longer time frame, and so hence the real critical issue of how do we bridge the gap between now and the moment where renewable will really have taken up to fill the gap. Last, I would like to say, one of the let's say negative or worrying effect of this global crisis, and I suppose we'll be talking about the geopolitical aspect afterwards, because this is probably the most important one. I think we're redefining completely the geopolitical order, and this will have long-lasting and pervasive consequences on all aspects of the world in the coming decade. But more importantly, but on the short term, what happens with very high fossil fuel prices is that, of course, on the one hand, it will decrease the growth prospects, economic growth prospects, which in a way is good for climate, but also it gives a very good and generous business cases for fossil fuel investments. And this is something we need to be very careful about, because we all know that once an investment is done, you are locked in for typically 20 or 40 years. A lot more to be said on Repower EU, but I would summarize in saying this is a very ambitious plan. I cannot see really much better alternative than this plan. It is probably overly ambitious and maybe optimist in terms of the timescales, but we need at least to set that as an objective. And we need to be very careful that we manage to control as much as possible all the downside effects in terms of the transition to low carbon technologies.
Mm-hmm. John, turning to you next. Very similar question. what are you looking for from Repower EU in terms of those concrete steps that your members can act on, particularly given that you mentioned, a lot of what's being asked for in the short term in terms of capital investments to use more oil and refinery power, right, are a little bit at odds with the longer term vision, both of your members and in some cases the Repower EU plan itself.
Well, yeah, thank you, Reid. What we need to do for the long term is quite capital intensive. If you're looking at CCS plants, hydrogen plants, advanced biofuels, you're typically talking about billion-dollar projects that require great stability in the financial structure around them and supplying markets for low-carbon products that at the moment may not exist or may not be defined well. And our major concern, having said that we support the Repower EU and the Green Deal, our major concern, taking a high-level view here, is too many targets, not enough clarity on how you make the strong investment case. Because to be blunt and maybe a little harsh, it doesn't matter what your target is. If you can't achieve a rate of progress towards that target, it's a bit irrelevant. And too many times we find that it's quite hard making a case for what does an investment look like, where you need clarity over, say, 10 or 15 years over what are the inputs and outputs for that business case. And in particular, what gives you a premium over a fossil fuel product to enable you to make a renewable or low carbon product or service, and know that over that 10 or 15 years of the life and the financial plan for the project, that you'll make a profit. Because we are, of course, a market-based economy, not a centrally planned economy. And making that investment case continues to be the difficulty. So Repower EU, we think it can be helpful. It's helping to refocus on a number of different priorities. But can I also make a link to the previous discussion and points that Jacob was making about collaboration with Canada? Because for us also, one of the objectives has got to be an internationalization of Europe's approach. Europe has been quite narrowly focused so far. And if anything, the war in Ukraine has revealed the sensitivity to dependencies and the fact that we need to have a greater consideration of our international engagement. Actually, Canada is very well placed in the short term, whether it's gas, oil, diesel, or other distillate fuels, can certainly help there. But for the longer term, already, Jacob, you said very well, hydrogen, but also I'd add to that carbon removals technologies, CCS, CCU, carbon sinks, biomass. Canada has a huge amount of land and agriculture and forestry. And advanced biofuels, we think, is an under-emphasized set of technologies where, for sure, Canada could play a role there. So we think that focusing on getting the investment case right so that we get a faster rate of progress towards the long-term objectives, and also an internationalization, developing the relationships around raw materials, both minerals for batteries and the renewable electricity sector, but also renewable energy molecules as well, is a direction that we'd like to see pursued further. And that's the basis of a lot of our engagement with the European institutions today.
I want to touch on this idea of internationalization and diversification, particularly in the context of those long-term goals. And we were, of course, talking about this as well just before the panel. And it's really the idea around those critical mineral material supply chains. The issue that we're dealing with right now is that our fossil fuel supply chain, particularly in Europe, was a little bit too single-sourced in some cases, and now we're dealing with those consequences. The unfortunate reality, at least as it stands currently, and we talked about this in a session yesterday, is that looking at those mineral supply chains, there's some cases equal, if not more, concentration throughout that supply chain. And so you're going to need that internationalization. It's, of course, the place where Canada can help. Julia, let's start with you. Very briefly, what do you see as Canada's role in that mineral supply chain. You mentioned the job creation opportunities domestically in Canada, but how do you take those resources and that supply chain expertise and export that expertise almost in a way which further diversifies the global community's push towards these renewable energy technologies in Europe and beyond?
It's a good question. So it goes to the two pieces. I mean, it's about the actual export of the natural resource itself, but making sure that we're taking advantage of the opportunities to actually process it here as well. Like there are real opportunities, and it does go to jobs. I think that's important when we're talking about the transition. As Jacob mentioned, we're a market-based economy, and it's really important that we take that into account as to how we develop. But it's also to creating those synergies with our partners. We're really lucky. We do have many of those critical minerals here. We don't have all of them. And in some places, it makes real sense to work with our allies as to what they have, what we have, and how we can best produce them together. And create those trade corridors. And our ESG standards do play an important part of that. And I think that it's really important to highlight that. We have strong environmental regulations. We are very much working on reconciliation in our country and taking into account the needs to actually include Indigenous peoples in the process. When we're looking at our mining industry, we have a strong governance model here in this country. So we are that trusted partner when it comes to critical minerals. How do we make sure that we use our natural resources to develop our own economy here, and at the same time work with our allies to have those trade corridors on them? It's a wonderful opportunity, and it's something that I don't think we talk enough about.
Jacob, I want to give you a chance to tackle this as well, but again, being that John mentioned you directly when we're talking about the export of some of these new clean energy technologies, hydrogen, CCS, what is your reaction to that in terms of Canada's ability to help internationalize the growth of these technologies?
So, I mean, there's a vibrant domestic conversation afoot on all of these issues, and we have government action plans and roadmaps for hydrogen, for small modular reactors, for all the different new technologies that will help us reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. And we're starting to assume a leadership position in this. I think it's safe to say, and really, I think it is about trust and values at the end of the day. Unfortunately, I think in the European circumstance, became quite reliant on an energy provider who, at the end of the day, they don't share values with. With us as a Canadian supplier, we share the same values. And this is very important. It's fundamental to trust. In Canada, I would also dare say that the climate debate, I think, is somewhat settled. And I say that because we believe in climate change, we believe that it's man-made, and we believe that it's up to us to reduce our emissions and to solve it. This is not a debate in Canada. There is no major political party in Canada that denies climate change. They all have different ideas and priorities on how they want to address it, and that debate is healthy, and it's good, and it helps guide our industry. But when it comes to Europe, when we look at your values and what you want from your energy system and your energy future, I think we're there with you. I think we're very closely aligned. We just have to connect more than we've connected in the past. Our focus has traditionally been very much on the United States, makes a lot of sense. Europe's focus has been very much on Russia and its geographical situation. We've got to open all that up. You have to reach out to us. We have to reach out to you. And when we talk to each other, we actually realize that we're interested in the same solutions. And Canada just has an enormous capacity to be able to deliver them. We have more engineers working in the hydrogen space than any other G20 country, for example. We get the future of that technology. We can make green, blue, pink, whatever color hydrogen you want, Europe. We can make it for you. We just have to develop the ties. We have to let you know each other, we exist, that we like each other, that we get along, that we trust each other. And I really don't think that should be a problem.
I think your reference to climate change not being a debate in Canada is an implicit dig at the lone American on the panel, but that's not there. The timer in front of me is starting to flash, so I want to give a brief moment for each of our panelists to have one last swing at this issue. We'll start with you, Adel. Very briefly. This is a massive issue. What are the risks and opportunities that we haven't talked about today? What are the key messages you want to leave us with as we move on with the rest of our day?
Okay, thank you. It's obviously a quite open question. I would like to say, first of all, I'm very happy that Julie has opened a question of critical minerals, because in my view, it's very obvious that the dependencies will shift from sourcing fossil fuel progressively to sourcing these critical minerals, in which you find a subcategory which is a rare earth. And it's very important to understand that the biggest part of the production of these critical minerals is Chinese. They own approximately 65 to 70% of the production of these critical minerals, and even more for rare earth. So this will become a very, very critical aspect, and the priorities will be shifting quite rapidly there. As elaborating on this, I would like, it's very, very interesting to see the perspective that I can hear from Canada and from the United States, which are, I would say, countries of plenty. We are not at all in this situation in Europe. And for instance, as I said, it's the first time maybe since 1973 that we're talking about rationing, about moderation. But I think this is very important, because I think there's more and more scientific evidence, and personally, I totally share this view that technology is absolutely critical to reach climate neutrality, but it's only an enabling part. Technologies are an enabling climate neutrality. But we won't get to climate neutrality just because we have or we develop better technologies. I think there's simply, and again, there's scientific evidence on this, there's simply no way that we can realistically completely decarbonize our economy while keeping the same indicators and the same fascination for economic growth. And you could see very clearly that in Europe, at least, this whole debate about moderation starts to pick up. And I think this is a very, very important element that will get more and more traction in the discussions in the coming months and years. Of course, it needs much more explanation and debate, but this would be at least the last element I would like to drop in this panel as a subject of reflection.
John, any last words as we wrap this issue up?
Let me just take a narrower focus on the business model of the fuels industry. Having talked about all the other technologies that we need, and recognizing absolutely that electrification of transport is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, SUP has taken a little bit too strong an emphasis on complete electrification of just about everything that moves. While at the same time, it's a strange position to be the industry that supplies the energy today for almost everything that moves today. We think energy molecules needs more emphasis. We've seen something of an investment bubble around electrification and one or two electric car companies. That's obviously helped boost that sector. We don't have a bubble around anything else. Bubbles aren't necessarily that healthy. It would be nice to have a little bit more emphasis around advanced biofuels, synthetic fuels, routes to make use of biomass and energy molecules. And we're encouraged by the fact that both Canada and the US has maybe a slightly healthier balance, shall we say, between looking at all of those different technologies. And we are dismayed that Europe still has an excessive focus on pure electrification. We think that energy security and diversification would be very helpful here and well served by having the strategy to also evolve how we make liquids and gaseous fuels easily transportable, easily manufacturable, and tradable internationally to be part of a renewable strategy. And that's something that we'll continue to push forward with the Repower EU and the other developments of the European Green Deal. And wherever possible, if we can collaborate with Canadian industry on that, we'd be delighted to do so.
Jacob, any final thoughts before we turn to Julie for the last word here?
Canada, when you get to energy, really, what are we talking about? We're talking about managing an embarrassment of riches in this country. We have more than enough of what we need. The world needs what we have. We have to figure out how to share it better. Doing it through the market-based, rules-based economy works for us. Really, we should probably have a stronger connection to Europe than we already do. A bit our fault, I think. Also Europe, we need strong signals from you. But again, our values are so strong, this shouldn't be hard. We should be able to assist you in your hour of need while also working with you toward changing energy systems to meet your needs in the future. This should not be difficult. We are in a country now, in Canada, we're not going to be facing gas rationing this winter. Let's all think about that. In Europe, they may very well be facing gas rationing, and we know winter is coming, right? This is serious business. And us Canadians, it's morally incumbent upon us to try and figure out how to help Europe during its hour of need in the short term and in the long term. But because we share the same values and we share the same approach toward doing things, I think we're going to get there. Critical minerals, we have them in Canada. We are ready to develop them. We must first and foremost do right by the Indigenous people on whose lands these minerals may be found. But the good news is through energy development, we have figured out paths toward being able to do that. So let us continue to work on that in that way, and hopefully we can be a supplier to you in the future.
Julie, send us off.
Awesome. I think it's been a really great conversation. And if I could bring it back to where you started, which is there a false choice? Well, what's been really great about this conversation is very much that we found there isn't. Mm-hmm. And I think that needs to be reinforced over and over again, that we can continue to work to meet our own energy needs, but also to be a partner to support our allies in their energy needs in a way that doesn't have to make a trade-off. Mm-hmm. And that I think it's very important that we look at what are the immediate short-term needs. Winter is coming, and we as Canadians can understand exactly what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And yet we are so well placed, and we need to keep our eye on the future. So we need these things like the critical minerals conversation is so central. Hydrogen is going to be a big piece of that question as well. But also, what are we doing to help with other forms of transition, be it, with retrofitting our buildings, be it with our vehicles, and what are the opportunities for Canada? We have some great opportunities as well to be a real economic powerhouse in all of this, to be a leader for our partners, and that we can also be there to show support when it's needed. That's a nice place to be. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty nice moment to be proud to be a Canadian and to say we have unwavering support for our European allies and that we're really ready to step up to be those partners. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. There you have it. Too much to try and cover in 45 minutes. In fact, I went longer than 45 minutes, so I apologize for that, everyone. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists, the IEFA Conference from Montreal. And with that, I'll close the session. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you.